Francis was born in 1182 in the city of Assisi, a small locality of Umbria in medieval Italy. His baptismal name was Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardoni, but he was called Francesco because his father, Pietro, was a cloth merchant and spent a great deal of time in France, from where he brought both the inspiration for the name and a love for the things of that region. From a young age, Francis grew up surrounded by a certain comfort and wealth, for his family had considerable possessions, the fruit of the flourishing trade in central Italy. However, although he had this material security, already in his childhood, one could notice a cheerful heart, detached and inclined to generosity. In his youth, Francis was known for his festive spirit, for being a cheerful young man who enjoyed parties, music, and gatherings with friends. He was seen as someone who took pleasure in living, often spending without measure, for he knew his father could easily replenish the resources. He was called by many the King of Youth in Assisi. So great was his ability to enchant people, whether by his joy or by his carefree way of life. This phase, however, was only the prelude to a much greater transformation that God was preparing. The city of Assisi at that time was a place of intense political and social conflicts. There were disputes between social classes and also wars between neighboring cities, especially between Assisi and Perugia. Francis, although of bourgeois origin, ardently desired to achieve the glory of knighthood. His ambition led him to dream of titles of nobility, wishing to become a knight, as he saw in this path a means of gaining honor and prestige. However, God had other plans, very different, for that ambitious and joyful young man. Francis's father, Pietro, had great expectations for him, wanting his son to follow the family business and become even richer and more influential. His mother, Pica, on the other hand, had a more sensitive spirituality and sowed in Francis small seeds of faith and piety. Even so, Francis's youth was marked more by luxury and parties than by prayer, although deep down his heart was always open to goodness and to compassion for the poor. A striking characteristic of Francis from early on was his generosity. Even though he lived a life of excess, he was unable to see a poor person without feeling compassion. It is said that, while still young, he once met a beggar and, moved by his misery, gave him part of his clothing. This gesture, though it seemed small, was already a sign of what one day would be taken to the extreme, the total giving of himself to those most in need. The religious environment of Assisi also had an influence. The city had several churches, and processions were common, bringing people closer to the mystery of Christ. Francis was not indifferent to these manifestations of faith, even though in his youth he had not yet turned fully to God. He saw with enchantment the beauty of the chants and the liturgy, but his soul longed for worldly glories, as if something within him were always in conflict. Francis's adolescence was marked by this contrast. On one hand, the pursuit of pleasure and parties; on the other, small acts of charity and a latent spiritual sensitivity. It was as if God were already shaping him, slowly preparing him for a life of radical conversion. These signs, although discreet, would later be remembered by his contemporaries as indications of the spiritual greatness that would blossom. Even at the parties, Francis had a heart that drew others, not only because of his enthusiasm, but because of his kindness. He did not humiliate the poorest in his city. On the contrary, he sought to be close to them. His reputation was that of a friendly, open and generous young man, but still very attached to the fascination of the world. In the eyes of his family and friends, he seemed destined for a life of success and glory, perhaps as a merchant, perhaps as a knight. But God saw more deeply. It was common at that time for young men from wealthy families to seek military adventures to gain prestige. Francis, infected by this spirit, soon dreamed of becoming a knight, taking part in the battles that were unfolding between Assisi and neighboring cities. This desire marked a crucial moment in his youth, for it was precisely on this path of seeking glory that the Lord intervened decisively, leading him to the beginning of his true vocation. Thus Francis's childhood and youth reveal an ordinary young man of his time, full of dreams, vanities, and desires for recognition, but at the same time profoundly human, compassionate, and generous. It was a mixture of worldliness and seeds of holiness, which the Holy Spirit would cultivate until it blossomed into one of the most beautiful stories of conversion in the Catholic Church. Francis's youth was marked by great dreams of glory, and one of the greatest was to become a knight. In the Middle Ages, knighthood was a symbol of prestige, honor, and recognition. Francis, as the son of a wealthy merchant, saw in this possibility a way to rise socially and gain respect. Thus, when Assisi entered into conflict with neighboring Perugia, he did not hesitate to enlist, wishing to prove his courage on the battlefield. War, however, would be God's first instrument to break his earthly plans and make room for a new vocation. In the battle against Perugia, Francis did not achieve the victory he dreamed of. On the contrary, he ended up captured and made a prisoner of war. This experience was a hard blow for the young man who dreamed of becoming a hero. For more than a year, Francis remained imprisoned under difficult conditions, living with the humiliation of defeat and the uncertainty of the future. Prison became for him a time of deep reflection, for he began to perceive the fragility of his human projects. Many of his youthful companions lost their lives, and he, spared, began to question the purpose of his existence. When he was released, he returned to Assisi deeply shaken. Although he still harbored the desire to become a knight, he was no longer the carefree, festive young man he had been before. Imprisonment had marked him, and a void grew in his soul. Even resuming social life, parties and friendships, he no longer felt the same joy. Something seemed to be lacking, a restlessness he could not silence. The world no longer satisfied him completely, and this interior thirst would be the prelude to the great transformation that was about to happen. Shortly thereafter, he decided to try once again to fulfill the dream of knighthood. He prepared to head toward southern Italy, with the aim of enlisting in a military campaign under the Pope's orders. His heart was full of expectations, believing that he could finally attain the honor he so desired. However, on his journey, God intervened in a mysterious way. One night, Francis had a revealing dream. A voice told him that he should return to Assisi, for the glory that God had reserved for him was not the glory of earthly knights, but that of serving the Lord. This dream moved him deeply. Although reluctant, he decided to obey and return to his hometown. His friends mocked his decision, accusing him of cowardice or weakness, but Francis knew that there was something greater behind that voice. This experience began to open his soul to a new sensitivity, and the young man who had previously thought only of earthly glory began to ask himself about God's will for his life. The failure of his plans was, in fact, the provident hand of the Lord leading him to something much greater. Upon returning to Assisi, Francis went through a period of inner crisis. He no longer felt at ease at banquets and parties, nor did he find meaning in his father's ambitions. His heart inclined more and more toward prayer, silence, and charity. He began to distance himself from his former circles of friends and to seek moments of reflection. Often he took refuge in solitary places where he could pray and weep before God, asking for light to understand what was happening to his soul. He himself did not understand it well, but he knew he was being called to something new. During this time, his sensitivity toward the poor increased considerably. Those who had previously received only occasional alms from Francis now saw him stop to talk, touch their wounds, and offer help. This contact with human suffering moved him intensely, as if he saw in the faces of the marginalized something that mysteriously attracted him. Little by little, He began to perceive that there was more beauty in the simplicity of the poor than in the riches and honors he had so much sought. Another decisive moment of this inner crisis was when Francis fell gravely ill. During his convalescence, he plunged into reflections on the brevity of life and the vanity of all his projects. Illness placed him before the fragility of the human condition, showing him that all earthly glory passes and crumbles like dust. At the same time, he felt in his heart a new peace when he prayed, as if God were consoling him and leading him to something greater. This period was like a foreshadowing of death for the old man and birth for the new man. Francis also began to have interior visions. In one of them, he saw a castle filled with weapons, but he understood that they were not for him, but for another. With this, he perceived that God was calling him to a different battle, not one fought with swords and horses, but with humility and love. This understanding, still confused, made him abandon once and for all his military dreams, opening himself to the Lord's call. From then on, his life would no longer be the same. Vanity gave way to the desire to find the true will of God. The young man of Assisi, formerly fun-loving and ambitious, entered a stage of discernment. It was as if God had stripped him of all illusions and slowly prepared him for the great mission that would change not only his life, but also the life of the Church and of all Christendom. His soul began to incline toward the crucified Christ, although he did not yet know the depth of that path. Francis's inner crisis was, therefore, the foundation upon which his vocation would be raised, no longer to fight for human crowns, but for the eternal crown. After his inner crisis, Francis began to walk through the city of Assisi in a different way. His friends no longer recognized him, for that young man who had once led parties and banquets now withdrew to pray or lingered long in front of the poor. He spent hours reflecting on life, and instead of seeking glories, he bowed before the simplicity of those who had nothing. He was often seen giving his clothes or money to the needy, something that made his father furious, for Pietro wanted his son to be a respected businessman, not someone who squandered the family fortune on alms. One of the most striking moments of this phase was when Francis encountered a leper on the road. Until then, he had a horror of approaching the sick, especially lepers who were marginalized, isolated, and viewed with fear by society. However, on that day, he felt an inner force that impelled him to dismount his horse, embrace the leper, and kiss his wounds. This gesture transformed his soul, for he discovered that, in overcoming his disgust and fear, he found an inexplicable joy. Later, he himself would testify that it was at that moment that his life took a great step toward conversion. From then on, Francis sought to be ever closer to the poor and marginalized. He not only gave them alms, but spoke with them, treated them with dignity, and placed himself as an equal. It was as if, in each suffering face, he saw the living presence of Christ. This perception would become the heart of his spirituality, the conviction that Jesus makes himself especially present in the little ones and the despised. For Francis, the world of the poor ceased to be a space of rejection and became a school of love and holiness. While he was living this transformation, a decisive event occurred in his spiritual life. One day, in search of silence and prayer, Francis entered the small, abandoned chapel of San Damiano on the outskirts of Assisi. The place was in ruins, with worn walls and a Byzantine crucifix before the altar. Kneeling there, he began to pray fervently, asking God to enlighten his path. It was then that he had a profound mystical experience. Before the crucifix, he clearly heard the voice of Christ saying to him, "Francis, go and rebuild my church, which is in ruins." That phrase echoed in his soul as a direct and personal call. Initially, Francis believed that it was about literally rebuilding the ruined chapel where he was praying. Thus, he went out determined to put into practice what he had heard. He sold some goods from his father's shop and with the money began to buy stones and materials to restore San Damiano. This gesture provoked Pietro's anger, who saw in his son an irresponsible person, incapable of managing the family's goods. From that moment on, a growing conflict began between father and son, which would culminate in a definitive break. The task of rebuilding San Damiano was only the beginning. Francis extended his efforts to other abandoned churches in the region, such as San Pietro and the Porziuncola, which would later become a center of Franciscan spirituality. With his own hands, he carried stones, repaired walls, and worked as a simple mason. He was not ashamed to humble himself before the city because he was convinced that he was obeying Christ. To many, it seemed madness. To him, it was obedience and love. At this time, prayer before the crucifix of San Damiano became increasingly intense. Francis felt that he was not only rebuilding walls, but that God was preparing him for something much greater, to restore the very Church of Christ, not in stones, but in holiness and witness. The ruined chapel was a symbol of the church wounded by riches, corruption, and spiritual coldness in his time. The mission that Christ entrusted to him was to be an instrument of renewal, living the gospel in a radical and authentic way. While working on the reconstruction, Francis became ever more detached. He dressed simply, rejected the comforts of his youth, and sought to live as a poor man. This path, however, also brought him scorn and mockery. Many of his former friends laughed at him in the streets, calling him crazy. His father, ashamed, even dragged him before the city's bishop to demand that he renounce his inheritance and return everything he had spent. Before the assembly, Francis made a radical gesture. He returned even the clothes he wore and, naked, declared that from then on, he would have only God in heaven as his father. This episode marked a definitive turning point. Francis broke with the material bonds that tied him to his family and surrendered himself totally into God's hands. He clothed himself in a simple tunic made of coarse cloth and began to live on alms, dedicating himself only to the service of the Lord. That wealthy, fun-loving young man now became a poor man of God, willing to live in total dependence on providence. For everyone, his radical choice was sealed, to follow Christ poor and crucified. Thus, the encounter with the poor, the kiss to the leper, and the experience before the crucifix of San Damiano formed the basis of his conversion. Francis discovered that true wealth lies in stripping oneself of everything and finding in Christ the only treasure. From this experience was born the Franciscan charism, which to this day inspires millions of the faithful to live the gospel with simplicity, poverty, and love. After breaking definitively with a life of wealth and privileges, Francis began to live in a radically simple way. He walked barefoot along the roads, wore only a poor tunic in the shape of a cross, and, with a cord at his waist, presented himself to the world as a servant of Christ. He no longer sought the applause of men, but only to live the gospel in its essence. For him, Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount were literal. He should be poor, meek, peaceable, and humble, trusting solely in God's providence. His life increasingly became a living reflection of the poor Christ of Bethlehem and the crucified Christ on Calvary. This interior transformation of Francis began to touch other people deeply. Many looked at him with strangeness, calling him crazy or a fanatic, but some young men of Assisi, moved by his authenticity, drew near to understand his choice better. They saw in Francis a man free, detached from everything, but full of true joy. Little by little, they realized that that life of poverty and surrender to Christ was a source of peace that the world could not offer. This silent attraction generated the beginning of a small fraternity. The first companion to join Francis was Bernard of Quintaval, a wealthy merchant of the city who, touched by the saint's witness, decided to sell all his goods and distribute them to the poor. This gesture caused enormous impact, for it showed that the radicalness of Francis was not only possible for him, but also for others who wished to follow the same path. Soon after, another man named Peter of Catani also joined them, followed by Giles of Assisi, who would become known for wisdom and simplicity of life. Thus, little by little, a fraternity was born. The group grew not through theoretical speeches, but by example. Francis and his companions lived as brothers, begging for their daily bread, sleeping in improvised shelters, and spending long hours in prayer. They possessed nothing in common except the ardent desire to live the gospel in all its radicalness. The simplicity of their life contrasted with the luxury and pomp of medieval society, and this attracted everyone's attention. Many asked themselves, how could these young men live so poor and at the same time so happy? In 1208, during a mass in the small chapel of the Porziuncola, Francis heard the gospel in which Jesus sends the disciples on mission, saying that they should take neither gold nor silver, nor 2 tunics nor sandals, but that they should announce peace and conversion. Upon hearing these words, Francis exclaimed, "This is what I want, this is what I seek, this is what I desire to do with all my heart." That moment was decisive, for he understood that his mission was to follow in the footsteps of Christ and the apostles, living in absolute poverty and preaching the good news. Over time, the companions multiplied. Young men of various origins, simple men, and even some nobles were enchanted by the evangelical way of life proposed by Francis. They formed an itinerant fraternity, without properties, without palaces, and without titles. They walked from city to city, preaching peace, penance, and the love of Christ. They slept under the stars, lived on alms, and worked when possible, always keeping a spirit of humility and service. This lifestyle began to attract the attention of ecclesiastical authorities. Many priests viewed with suspicion that group of young men who, without being clerics, preached in the streets and called people to conversion. Some accused them of heresy, confusing them with radical movements that were arising at the time. Francis, however, always remained faithful to the Church, insisting that his mission would only make sense in communion with the Pope and the magisterium. His obedience would become a hallmark of the Franciscan movement. In view of the fraternity's growth, Francis decided to seek the Church's approval. He gathered his first companions and wrote a simple form of life based on the Gospels, in which he described how they should live in poverty, fraternity, and obedience. This text, known as the First Rule, was short and objective but full of evangelical spirit. With it in hand, Francis and his brothers went to Rome in 1209 to present their proposal to Pope Innocent III. The arrival in Rome was a challenge. Many cardinals and clerics looked upon those poor young men with distrust, thinking it impossible for someone to live without possessing anything. However, divine providence prepared a decisive encounter. Pope Innocent III had a dream in which he saw the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome about to collapse, but a small poor man was supporting it with his hands. Recognizing in Francis the man of the dream, the Pope verbally approved the rule, authorizing the group to live as a fraternity in the name of the Church. Thus, the Order of Friars Minor, better known as the Franciscans, was officially born. It was not merely a religious community, but a true spiritual revolution based on simplicity, evangelical poverty, and radical love for Christ. Francis did not want to found a powerful order, but a humble fraternity, called to serve and to bear witness to the joy of the gospel. From that moment, the small seed sown in Assisi began to blossom throughout Christendom. After the approval of the First Rule and the blessing of Innocent III, Francis returned to Assisi with his companions, not as solitary adventurers, but as brothers officially recognized by the Church. This confirmation brought even greater vigor to the fraternity, which began to attract new followers from various regions of Italy. The young were won over not only by Francis's words, but above all by the witness of his life. A simple, joyful, poor man, totally given to Christ. The order of Friars Minor grew like a fire that spread silently, warming the hearts of many. Francis's preaching was marked by simplicity. He did not seek erudition or elaborate speeches. He spoke with his heart, delivering the gospel in a direct and passionate way. His words had the force of someone who lived what he said, and thus they touched even the most hardened. He preached in squares, streets, and churches, announcing peace, penance, and the love of God. He frequently called everyone to repentance, not with threats, but with the tenderness of one who saw the beauty of Christian life as a gift. His voice, accompanied by his smile and humility, was capable of converting hearts. The life of the friars was radical. They owned nothing, asked alms to eat, and were content with what was offered to them. They walked on foot, often barefoot, crossing villages and cities. When they received a house to rest, they gave thanks. When they slept in the open, they likewise gave thanks. This total trust in providence attracted the admiration of simple people who saw in them true men of God. The Franciscans' witness was like a mirror of the gospel, and each day more people desired to live that way. One of the most important moments in the expansion of Franciscan spirituality was the encounter with Clare of Assisi. Clare was a young noblewoman from a wealthy and influential family who from an early age felt in her heart the desire to consecrate herself entirely to Christ. Upon hearing Francis preach in the Church of San Giorgio, she was deeply touched by his words and by the witness of his life. She recognized in him the authenticity of the gospel lived and began to seek him in secret, asking for spiritual guidance. This encounter would change not only her life, but also the history of the Church. On the night of March 18th, 1212, during Holy Week, Clare fled her home and went to the Porziuncola, where she was received by Francis and his friars. Before the altar, she cut her hair, put on a simple tunic, and made vows of poverty and consecration to God. Thus was born the second Franciscan order, known as the Poor Ladies, who would later be called the Poor Clares. Francis sent her to a nearby monastery, where other young women joined her, and Clare began to live a life of prayer, silence, and absolute poverty, being called the Little Plant of Francis. While Clare and her companions lived withdrawn in prayer, Francis and the friars traveled through cities and villages, evangelizing. The order expanded rapidly, reaching other regions of Italy and soon crossing its borders. Young men from all over Europe began to approach, eager to live the evangelical radicalness. The witness of poverty, simplicity, and fraternity won souls of all social classes, from peasants to nobles, because it revealed a way of life that directly reflected the gospel of Christ. Francis, however, always insisted that his brothers be obedient to the Church and live with humility. He feared that the rapid growth of the order would lead to vanity or a departure from its essence. For this reason, he constantly reminded everyone that they were lesser, that is, called to serve, to be beneath all, to be instruments of peace and not of power. Poverty was not only material, but spiritual, the poverty of one who does not seek glories, but places himself as the servant of all. This spirit sustained the identity of the fraternity. Over time, Francis's fame began to spread beyond the borders of Assisi. Many sought him not only to hear him, but to receive his blessing and counsel. He, however, remained always humble, refusing titles or honors, calling himself only the little poor man of God. His authority did not come from offices, but from witness. It was as if Christ spoke through his life. Francis's presence became a beacon that illuminated an age marked by conflicts and a thirst for authenticity. The encounter between Francis and Clare showed that the Franciscan charism was not only for men, but also for women. He represented the itinerant and missionary fraternity, she the contemplative and silent dimension. Together, they formed two faces of the same vocation, to live the gospel in its radicalness, in poverty, and in total love of God. This complementarity made the Franciscan spirit even richer and more complete, encompassing both the active life and the contemplative life. Thus, in a few years, what began with a young man called Crazy in Assisi was transformed into a spiritual movement of European scope. The seed sown before the crucifix of San Damiano now sprouted into a great tree whose fruits would be countless over the centuries. Francis, Clare, and their first companions inaugurated a new way of living the gospel, which rekindled in the heart of the church the flame of simplicity and the joy of serving Christ, poor and crucified. With the Franciscan fraternity growing and gaining strength, Francis began to dream of something even greater. His heart, inflamed by the love of Christ, did not want only to preach to the villages and cities of Italy, but desired that all peoples could hear the message of the gospel. For him, the fraternity had no borders, for every human being was a brother, created by the same God and loved by the same Christ. Thus, the missionary desire was born in his heart, which led him to undertake daring and risky journeys. At first, Francis encouraged his friars to go out in pairs, like the apostles, to announce peace and penance in neighboring regions. Some reached France, Spain, and even Hungary. He himself, however, felt that he needed to go further. His heart burned to reach distant lands, especially the East, where the Crusades placed Christians and Muslims in direct conflict. While many saw in Islam only enemies to be fought, Francis saw brothers to be loved and evangelized. His vision was profoundly evangelical, not to conquer by the sword, but by the witness of love and humility. In 1219, during the Fifth Crusade, Francis decided to travel to Egypt, where the Christian army was facing the Muslim Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil. He did not go as a soldier, but as a messenger of peace. Defying all dangers, he crossed the battlefield, was arrested, and brought before the Sultan. Many believed that he would be killed immediately, but to everyone's surprise, Francis was received with respect. His courage and serenity impressed the Muslim ruler, who agreed to speak with him. The encounter between Francis and the Sultan became one of the most striking episodes of his life. There were no hate speeches or violent debates there, but a frank and respectful dialogue. Francis proclaimed Christ with simplicity, bearing witness to his faith without imposing anything by force. The Sultan, touched by his humility and courage, did not convert, but recognized in Francis a true man of God. According to tradition, he offered him gifts, which Francis refused, accepting only the hospitality and peace of the encounter. This episode showed the world that true evangelization is not done with weapons, but with love and witness. Francis did not convert multitudes in the East, but he sowed a message that would resonate through the centuries. It is possible to dialogue with those who are different without losing the Christian identity, maintaining firmness of faith and at the same time universal charity. For him, every human being was the image of God and therefore worthy of respect and compassion, even if he professed a different faith. Back in Europe, Francis's missionary experience spread as inspiration. He encouraged his friars to go beyond borders, preaching everywhere. Many of them embarked on risky missions, some even suffering martyrdom. Francis saw in the blood of Franciscan martyrs the confirmation that his vocation was not one of earthly glory, but of total surrender to Christ. This missionary dimension became an essential part of Franciscan identity, uniting poverty, simplicity, and apostolic ardor. Francis's universal vision was also reflected in his relationship with creation. He perceived that not only human beings, but all creatures were brothers and sisters, the work of the hands of the same Creator. Thus, he called the sun brother, the moon sister, the animals companions, and even death, which many feared, he called sister. This cosmic vision of fraternity expressed his profound union with God and his recognition that everything participates in the same divine love. It is no coincidence that centuries later, St. John Paul II would call Francis the patron of ecology. His sensitivity toward nature was not merely poetic, but profoundly theological. He saw in creation the reflection of God's goodness and believed that when the human being cares for the world, he honors the Creator. This ecological spirituality, born in the heart of a poor man from Umbria, became a most current legacy for the Church and for all humanity. Francis's missionary witness was not limited to foreign lands. In every city he passed through, he was a missionary, calling to conversion with simple words and with a life of consistency. He did not need great strategies, for his poverty and his joy were the most effective weapons of his preaching. This evangelizing simplicity made him a modern apostle, capable of speaking to people's hearts without needing great structures. Thus, Franciscan missions showed the world a new way of evangelizing, not by imposition, but by witness, not by power, but by humility, not by force, but by peace. Francis became not only a reformer of the Church, but a true universal messenger of fraternity. His encounter with the Sultan was the sign that the gospel can cross borders, dialogue with different cultures, and sow peace even amid the greatest conflicts in history. As the Franciscan order grew, Francis began to realize that his role was not only to guide the brothers, but above all, to be a living example of Christ. He felt that God was calling him to an ever more intimate union with the Lord, a union that required not only poverty and humility, but also direct participation in the mystery of the cross. His last years of life were therefore marked by a radical deepening of his spirituality and by extraordinary mystical experiences that identified him in a singular way with the crucified Jesus. Francis's health began to deteriorate early, the result of a life of privations, severe fasts, sleepless nights, and long barefoot walks. His eyes were severely affected, probably because of infections and exposure to the sun, which caused him intense pain and near blindness. However, far from complaining, he welcomed illness as a participation in Christ's suffering, calling his infirmities sisters, just as he called all creatures. For him, nothing was a reason for despair, but everything was an opportunity to praise God. In 1224, Francis withdrew to Mount Verna in Tuscany in search of silence and contemplation. There he wished to spend 40 days in prayer, preparing for the feast of St. Michael the Archangel. It was during this retreat that he had one of the most extraordinary experiences in the history of Christian holiness. While praying intensely, he had a vision of a winged seraph bearing the figure of the crucified Christ. As he contemplated this vision, he felt in his heart a love and a pain so intense that he seemed to merge with Christ himself. At that moment, the stigmata appeared on his body, wounds in his hands, feet, and side, similar to the wounds of the crucifixion. Francis became, in a mysterious way, the first saint in the history of the Church to receive the stigmata of Christ. It was as if God confirmed, with this visible seal, Francis's intimate identification with his crucified Son. He began to bear, in his own body, the marks of the Passion, not as a sign of human glory, but as proof of a profound communion with the Lord. The wounds caused intense pains, but also an incomparable spiritual joy. Francis tried to hide the stigmata so as not to be venerated as a prodigy, but it was impossible to conceal completely the signs that many friars witnessed. The presence of the Stigmata confirmed that his life was not only an external imitation of the poor Christ, but an interior and real participation in his redemptive self-giving. The cross, which he loved so much, was now engraved in his very flesh. After this experience, his health declined rapidly. Francis lived amid pains, almost total blindness and extreme weakness. Even so, his joy remained intact. With a weak voice, he composed one of the most beautiful prayers in the history of the Church, the Canticle of the Creatures, also called the Canticle of Brother Sun. In this hymn, he exalted God for all creatures, calling the sun, the moon, the wind, water, fire, and the earth brothers and sisters. Even death he called sister, welcoming it as part of God's plan. This canticle expressed his vision profoundly reconciled with all creation. During his last days, Francis asked to be brought back to Assisi. He did not wish to die in a palace or in a comfortable bed, but on the simple ground, alongside the poor and his brothers. He asked to be placed naked upon the earth, for he wanted to die totally stripped, just as he had lived. His friars surrounded him, praying and singing, and Clare, from afar, accompanied with her sisters in prayer. The saint bid farewell to the world in the humblest way possible, faithful to the poor and crucified Christ to the very end. On the night of October 3rd, 1226, Francis gave his soul to God, singing and praising until his last moments. His face was lit with a heavenly peace, and his brothers testified that his death was not marked by sadness, but by a serene joy, as if he were going to meet the beloved whom he had always sought. His life ended as it had been, a canticle of love, humility, and total surrender. The news of his death spread quickly, and all the people of Assisi gathered to venerate him who, even in life, had already been recognized as a saint. His body was carried in procession and buried in the city, immediately becoming an object of popular devotion. A few years later, the Church would canonize him officially, recognizing in him one of the greatest saints of all Christendom. Francis left behind not only an order in full expansion, but a spiritual legacy that would forever change the history of the Church. His stigmata, his radical love for poverty, his fraternity with all creation, and his joy amid suffering showed that it is possible to live the gospel in a full and literal way. He thus became not only the little poor man of Assisi, but the alter Christus, the other Christ, called to inspire entire generations of Christians. Francis's death did not mean the end of his work, but rather the beginning of an even greater diffusion of his charism. Shortly after his passing in 1228, Pope Gregory IX canonized him officially, recognizing him as a saint of the Church. The quickness of his canonization shows the force of Francis's witness and the impact of his life. Multitudes already venerated him as an intercessor and model of holiness. In Assisi, the majestic Basilica of Saint Francis was raised, which would become a place of pilgrimage and a spiritual center for millions of the faithful. The order of Friars Minor, begun with only a few companions, spread rapidly throughout Europe and later throughout the world. Men of all backgrounds joined the Franciscan movement, embracing poverty, simplicity, and fraternity as a way of life. Besides the friars, Francis's spirituality also inspired the Poor Clares, founded by St. Clare and the Third Order, intended for lay people who, without leaving the world, wished to live Franciscan values in their families, professions, and communities. Thus, Francis's charism reached not only religious, but also fathers, mothers, and ordinary workers. One of the strongest marks left by Francis was his vision of universal fraternity. He did not see the world in divisions of classes, cultures, or religions, but as a single family of creatures before God. This vision, expressed in the Canticle of the Creatures, became one of the most beautiful inheritances of his spirituality. to recognize every person and every created being as brother and sister. In a time marked by wars and divisions, Francis brought to the world a message of peace and reconciliation, becoming a true prophet of harmony. His profound identification with the crucified Christ is also an essential part of his legacy. In receiving the Stigmata, Francis not only reflected Christ in his life, but united himself to him in his redemptive sufferings. This mystical union teaches that holiness does not consist in avoiding the cross, but in embracing it with love. For Christians of all times, Francis is a witness that true joy is born of total surrender to God, even amid the pains of life. The Franciscan spirit also influenced Western culture and art itself. Painters such as Giotto immortalized his life in beautiful frescoes. Writers and poets sang of his simplicity, and to this day, his figure inspires songs, films, and literary works. He became a universal symbol of humility, love for nature, and the pursuit of peace. His message crosses religious boundaries, speaking also to the hearts of men and women who seek a deeper meaning for life. Devotion to Saint Francis has spread across all continents. Churches, convents, and religious communities bear his name, and millions of people turn to him as an intercessor before God. His feast, celebrated on October 4th, is an occasion when the faithful around the world recall his example and renew their desire to live the gospel with simplicity. Even the blessing of animals, common on this date, is a reflection of his spirituality that embraces all creation as the work of the Creator. In modern times, Saint Francis has once again been highlighted in a special way. St. John Paul II called him the patron of ecology, recognizing in him a model of care for creation. Pope Francis, in choosing that name at his election in 2013, declared that he wanted his mission as Peter's successor to be inspired by the Saint of Assisi, a pope who dreams of a poor church for the poor, committed to peace and to the preservation of creation. This choice shows the impressive relevance of the Franciscan charism. Francis of Assisi remains to this day one of the most beloved and popular saints of the Catholic Church. His simple life, his radical poverty, his constant joy, and his total surrender to the gospel make him an example accessible to all, from the humblest to the great of the earth. He shows that holiness is not reserved for a few, but is a path open to anyone who loves with all his heart and gives himself without reserve to God. The legacy of Saint Francis is, above all, an invitation to live the gospel in a literal, concrete, and joyful way. He challenges us to abandon the superfluous, to look upon the poor as our brothers, to care for creation as God's gift, and to seek peace in all our relationships. His life is not only a story of the past, but a beacon for the present, showing that, amid the world's crises, the path of simplicity and fraternity remains the safest road toward Christ. Thus, Saint Francis of Assisi remains one of the most luminous figures in the history of the Church and of humanity. His existence, marked by radical love for Christ, continues to inspire generations, reminding us that it is possible to live the gospel authentically. The little poor man of Assisi invites us to rediscover the beauty of Christian life, the joy of being small before God, and the greatness of recognizing ourselves as brothers of all. His legacy does not grow old, for it is the very essence of the gospel, ever new, ever alive, ever transformative.